Good morning, friends, colleagues, students, members of the public. We welcome you to the 4th annual NWU Academic Freedom Lecture of 2022. My name is Klaus Beiter. I'm teaching in the law faculty. I'm a legal scholar. We have the privilege of having with us today Professor David McQuoid-Mason, who teaches and works at the Socio Center at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, and who is the president of the Commonwealth Legal Education Association, an icon of human rights education and of street law. If you Google his name on the internet, you will see photos of Prof. David with famous people, like there was this one photo that I saw with the late British monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. I assume that once Elizabeth had met Prof. David, she said to herself, "My mission in life has been accomplished. I can pass now." Prof. David has taught a lot of judges, at the time, of course, just his students, like Raymond Zondo, Mogoeng, and he will tell us all about that. Now, just a few words about the procedure today. I will hand over in a few seconds to our esteemed Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Teaching and Learning, Prof. Robert Balfour, who will give a word of welcome and introduce the speaker. Thereafter, you may forgive me for speaking for 5 to 7 minutes about the purpose of an academic lecture in a democratic South Africa. And after that, we will have our speaker speak for 50 or 60 minutes. And after that, we have a question and answer session. So members in the audience are welcome to ask questions. Members on Zoom are welcome to write their questions in the chat. I've got with me today my esteemed colleague, Richard Kolabai, who's sitting over there and who's taking care of the chat. And as David told me, you are more than welcome to ask questions during the talk, and if the opportunity arises, we'll ask him to answer them actually during the talk. So this then is the moment where I hand over to our DVC, Prof. Robert Balfour.
Thank you so much, Prof. Beiter, and colleagues, a very warm welcome to everybody who's able to join us at this time online from our 3 campuses, particularly Mahikeng, Vanderbijl, and Potchefstroom. We're glad to be able to offer this opportunity to the university, and Prof. David McQuoid-Mason is no stranger to the areas that are a focus in these lectures on a yearly basis. David has written over 350 articles, has had involvement in over 3,000 law schools across the Commonwealth, has had an impact in relation to human rights, law and democracy, medical law, as well as ethics. He has established South Africa's 3rd law clinic as early as 1973 and the country's first street law program in 1976 at the then University of Natal. Since then, he has helped develop law clinics in over 60 countries and set up street law programs in over 45 countries. He's contributed to a number of books and delivered well over 350 international presentations. He is honored by UNESCO for his work in human rights education and has been awarded DCL degrees honoris causa by the Universities of Windsor, Canada, and Northumbria in England. David is known for his work on social justice and the clinical legal education around the world. We are really delighted, David, to be able to meet you in person at Northwest University. I want to acknowledge that David and I have known each other for a good many years back when I was at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I remember him in exactly the same way as I've met him today. A wonderfully lively intellectual figure with a passion for education and a deep commitment to social issues around South Africa as well as beyond. In framing this lecture, I want also to acknowledge the university management, our leadership, our Vice-Chancellor who cannot join us today, Dr. Bismarck Thiebeck, I know extends warm greetings to you, Prof. David. My colleague, Prof. Jeffrey Mpuklele. Between Prof. Jeffrey and myself lie the organization of the annual lecture on academic freedom. I want also to acknowledge the special role of the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Dr. nwu-pukke, in supporting our event. From our office, Edwina Fransman, and from the DVC's offices in Ascension Kwepe, and then Sarita Murray, also from the Faculty of Law. Prof. David will be talking along the title of Teaching Human Rights in a Hostile Environment, the role of the university and some lessons learned from the struggle for democracy in South Africa. Welcome, Prof. David, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm just going to leave the platform and do what we do in street law, which is get down to the level of the students. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here back in Potchefstroom, I think after about 25 years or so. And good to see how the campus is changing. I spent a lot of time at the Mahakeng campus, setting up street law and legal aid clinics with someone there as well. And in those days, we had to be very careful about how we taught because the security police were watching us all the time in Mahakeng as well, which was then the old Botswana at the time. But it's always a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts. Just before I go into the more formal side of my talk, although my talks are never very formal, I want to just mention something about people might be saying, well, why are we talking about teaching human rights in a hostile environment and academic freedom in the modern South Africa? We've got the world's greatest constitution. We've got section 16.1, which actually says that academic freedom should be protected and fostered, and scientific inquiry as well. So why are we bothering about this? Well, the problem really is that back in the early 90s, I think it was, that universities in England and Australia and elsewhere started becoming more corporate institutions, and you got bureaucracies being set up and being run by the bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats were looking to see, what is the bottom line money-wise. They wanted publications when you generate it for the university. But at the same time, the academic tradition was that the young lecturers get dumped with all the work but then expected to publish. The professors up top don't get a very heavy load and they write papers and things. And so it's not really an equitable system. Wasn't that before? And even now with corporatization, it's got even worse. And the other one is political correctness. Because under apartheid, you'll see just now, we couldn't do things because of the law. Nowadays, we can't do things because of political correctness. It's not correct to talk about certain things. And the other thing is also that even today, if you are a whistleblower, and we have a fantastic Whistleblowers Act, whistleblowers get eased out. And that was happening under apartheid when the torture was being shown by district surgeons in Quebec. And now there, the woman who actually disclosed them eventually was put out, taken away from dealing with detainees and sent off to teach geriatrics or something. And the same thing is happening here, and we're hearing about it happening at some of our universities as well. When whistleblowers start drawing attention to corruption, they start getting eased out of the system. Anyway, that's today. So we can't just relax, keep an eye on academic freedom. And I just want to show you how we try to deal with this during the apartheid era. So let me begin. For human rights educators, if you're in a hostile environment, it's very difficult because you cannot, in some cases, in apartheid, we couldn't really talk about human rights till we got to Mandela's release, which I'm going to tell you about just now. But even during the 1980s, if you looked at the law and you saw the gaps, you were able to still do things. I mean, one of the best examples is that Hurley judgment when a detainee was being kept in detention without trial, and the courts weren't allowed to interfere. But they looked very carefully, the legal resources looked very carefully at the law, and the law said you can be detained for interrogation or prevent something, and they weren't interrogating the guy, they were just keeping him. So the court said we can interfere because you're not using the law as you're supposed to use it. So therefore the law can be interfered with here, the detention. So we looked at that. And the other thing was, and I'm going to talk about the street law, which is a program, and there aren't enough of you here to put up your hands to ask how many of you know about street law, but I came and helped set it up here years ago as well. But that is a method of teaching where you always give both sides and you let people decide. And because of that, I was able to do it in the apartheid-era schools, as I'm going to describe to you, even in the prisons and with prison officials, and I'll show you why just now. And the other one was that you weren't allowed to have protests, you couldn't have more than 2 people gathering outside and so on, and again I'll show you how we were able to deal with this. Whoops. Right, so I'm going to talk briefly about street law, then how you teach human rights without mentioning human rights, and then how you present it as a neutral, non-political program. Incidentally, I sent a tape off on human rights education to Iran, and they asked me, please don't mention politics. I said, I'm not mentioning politics, I'm mentioning human rights, and Iran has signed certain agreements, and I'm mentioning legal aid and what law clinics can do. Thank you, I apologize, I didn't mean to imply you were going to talk politics. Okay, you can get consent from the legal, you can get support from the legal profession, judiciary and government. And I'll show you again why this is important, because even under apartheid, there was a difference to authority. If you could show you were in an authoritative position, the security police would often respect that, and I'll show you some examples of that. Then how you integrate it into an academic program, how you persuade the law, and you won't believe it, but I'll show you just now, the Minister of Justice then, Kubi Kutsi, had to sign off a grant for street law. And what I did was show them how you teach people about the law, it turns them into good citizens, they'll become law-abiding citizens. So anyway, we'll talk about that. And then disguising political protest meetings as academic ones, and I'll show you again how to do that. And turning protest meetings into teach-ins. We actually incorporate the security police into your teaching as well, and I'll show you how we did that. And then lastly, how you can use professional bodies, both legal and medical ones, to do it as well. Okay, so the first street law program was started in 1972. Now, this is not a case of colonialism, and I'll talk about colonialism. People want to talk about that. And you know, there's a big sort of move, anti-colonialism at the moment, and people want to discuss that later. I'll talk about it. But a group of law students at Georgetown, now, you probably don't know, but Washington, D.C. is about 80% black, although it's the capital of the U.S. And where Georgetown Law School was in a ghetto area, an area where all the black kids were. And the black kids were smoking dope, they were ducking school, they weren't doing their homework, they were engaging in petty crime. Sounds a bit familiar. But so a bunch of students from Georgetown said, we want to go into the high schools. We want to teach the kids why it's important, how law touches their lives and how we have to use the law so we respect each other's rights. And one of the students was a guy called Ed O'Brien, who later became the executive director of an organization, which is now Street Law International. I've given you a very full slide so you can look at them later. And I learned about him when I went off as Dean of Law in 1984 to America. They wanted to show me American propaganda about their good programs, but I said I want to see law clinics. And they introduced me to Ed, who was doing street law. The next year, I invited him to South Africa. He said, how can we set that up in South Africa? I said, don't worry, come. And he arrived on the day that President P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency, which wasn't the best time for Ed to arrive. But anyway, there's just a picture of him quickly. He died a couple of years ago. You'll see I dedicated a book to him later. So first of all then, teaching it without mentioning human rights. What I did when Ed arrived was to get the only non-racial teachers organization in Durban to invite school teachers of all colors to bring 3 students with them and come to a workshop. As long as we were meeting inside, we could do that. We couldn't do it outside because not more than 2 people. And it was in a church hall, so that was okay as well back in 1985. I learned later the security police were videoing this whole thing, but that didn't matter. And the workshop itself was very interesting because it was the first time that black African kids had actually sat as equals with white kids in a school in the Durban area anyway, and with Indian kids. And for them and for us, it was an amazing exercise in human rights and diversity. And I'll explain it to you now, because there were 2 things I wanted to deal with. First of all, I wanted to show them the link between law and morality. I don't know how many of you heard of the case of Queen against Dudley and Stevens, Regina against Dudley and Stevens. If you've got any common law background, you'll know it. It's a case of the shipwrecked sailors. They shipwrecked, they're running out of food. One is a doctor, one's a cabin boy, one's a navigator. Navigator says we're 1,000 miles from anywhere. Nobody's going to rescue us. The doctor says we can go for 30 days without food or water. But only way we will survive then is if one of us dies and we eat him. And the cabin boy says, why don't we, on about the 30th, 29th day, he says, look, why don't we just toss a coin and kill someone who loses, and then we eat them, and then we will survive. So they all agree. So they toss the coin, and then the cabin boy loses. Now he says, I don't like this game. So this raises issues apart from, jurisdiction and everything, but did the cabin boy act morally here? He was quite happy to play the game as long as he was going to win, but if he didn't win, he thought the game wasn't fair. Anyway, so we discussed that, and then one of the black African kids put up her hands and said, but what about these laws we have in South Africa? They don't seem to be fair. We had a discussion about that, and then a white kid, a woman from a private school, put up her hand and said, why are we criticizing all these laws? Our parents voted for them. And the black kid's hands all went up and said, but our parents don't have a vote. And the white kid just went like this because she didn't realize she'd grown up in her protected cocoon, didn't even think about who had the vote. And so that was a learning experience for her to finally realize that, in fact, majority of people in our country were not able to vote. Another thing we did in this workshop was I realized a lot of people were being arrested at one stage. P.W. Botha had 10,000 kids arrested or something, down again in the Eastern Cape. So what I said was, who's been arrested here? Every single black kid put up their hand. They'd been arrested by the police somehow. Then I said to a white kid, all right, here's a scenario. Here's a man walking down the street, second-hand clothes. Come out here and show us how you think the police arrest someone. Now, they'd been watching LA Law and all these American programs. So they walk up, grab the arrested person by the wrist. Excuse me, sir, I'm arresting you. These are your rights. And the black kids just laughed. They said, ha, ha, ha. That's not what happened. So I said, okay, come out here and arrest him the way you think the police arrest people. And the black kid pretended to punch the other one, swore at the other one, and so on, because that was the reality of their life. And then I was able to talk about, okay, even under the emergency, these are the powers of the police, these are your rights of citizens. So again, we're not talking directly about human rights, but we're actually learning about issues of the law and human rights. At the end of this workshop, I got them all to brainstorm a list of topics they thought we should write materials and train people on. And they wanted an introduction to law and the legal system. How does it work? They wanted to know about criminal law in those days, juvenile justice or child justice today, we call it. Consumer law, what happens when we buy things and they don't work. Family law, social welfare law, and employment law. In the first couple of years, I got the students to write the materials, and we produced them in little booklets. There's the very first one we did, was called Street Law. Then we got into trouble because I got an Afrikaner colleague in the Afrikaans department to translate street law, and she said straatrecht. And the Law Society guys went crazy. They said, you can't use that, that means prostitute law, that means gutter law. So I said, well, that's fine, we want to help those people. Anyway, they said, you can carry on, but you've got to call it now Allemansrecht, which I think they got from the Germans. Where's Klaus? I think that's a German word as well for that, Allemansrechte. So this was the second book we did. And that one was interesting because it became so popular that the police ordered copies of it because it was all about criminal procedure and stuff in simple language. So all the police stations had it. Then we did one on family law, we did one on consumer law. And then eventually, tutors came along and said, can't we put these all into one manual? So I said, fine. So we produced, the third edition was this, the second edition, the street law manual here. And then I started doing international work, and these are the Mongolians. You see, they had the same color as their street law book, the same color as ours. They produced street law books. So it went on. This is our third edition of street law, but that's the Russian street law book where they've got a very wise crow in it. This is the Polish street law book, with an emphasis on some of the things they like to eat. Anyway, so there are a whole lot of, and I'll talk about some of the other stuff we did. All right, but this is the important thing about street law. It's complete, it turns academic teaching upside down. Who's doing legal education? Okay, watch this. Okay, first thing is classes are student-centered, not lecturer-centered, and I'll explain that to you just now. Participants are active learners, not passive, just sitting there listening. Instructors end up being facilitators, not so much lecturers. So how do we do this? First thing is always ask and then tell. Give the students a case study if you want to. Say to the students, what do you think the judgment should be in this case? Get the students to argument. Who's in favor? Who's against? Do your arguments. Come up, make a decision. All right, that's what you guys found. Now let's see what the court said. And you then show them what the court said. But they are actually thinking about it, and you'll be surprised. This was long before people had cell phones and could use, your cell phone to do research or anything. But even with that, I mean, what I would do was say to the students, oh, these are the facts of a case. If they've got their take your cell phone and take 10 minutes, go and find out and work out arguments for the prosecution or defense or whatever it is. So we always ask first and then tell, because it helps you gauge the knowledge of your students as well. The second thing to remember is it's about you. It's not about you, it's about the students. Not about how great you are, how many PhDs you've got, how much knowledge you've got. It's how much are the students going to learn. That's what's important. And the third one is less or more. Don't drown them in facts. Give the students the tools, give them the principles and the tools, and they can go and learn for themselves. And the way we do that is to use in our lesson plans, we want to make law relevant to people's lives. And that's what I think getting rid of anti-colonialism should be. Let's make law relevant to people's lives. Let's not just argue too much about who were colonialists and who weren't, because Africans colonized the whole world 60,000 years ago. All the Europeans, Australians, Americans came from 7 African mothers from the Rift Valley. So we don't want to go back looking at who colonized who and who. take the best. What was the best we've still got in traditional law that affects people's lives today? What is the best that we've got from the colonial period? What are the best we've got from our constitution? What is the best we can get from other? Just what is going to be good to make it relevant to people's lives? And we see this in our country now. If people think, look, the law doesn't work, then nobody's going to obey the law. We just take the law into our own hands. So if the law is irrelevant to us, we take it into our own hands. Anyway, the street law lesson has 5. This is what we train the students to do, 5 elements. First one is legal content. This is usually what you taught at law school. This is what the law says. This is what the judges have said. These are what the Roman Dutch writers, the Constitution. We go beyond that. The second thing we always ask is, what are the policy considerations? Why do we have these laws? Why do we have a law which says that gender abuse is wrong? Why do we have that law? Okay, it's in the Constitution, but why? Why do we have it? And if you understand why something happens, and is it working in practice or not, then you're actually much easier to remember it if you understand why you have a law. Then we always talk about conflicting values, which is law. Law is all about that. There are always lawyers arguing about different sides of things. But you take the example, a man beats his wife, assaults her badly, she lays an assault charge, goes before a magistrate, he's found guilty, but he's the only breadwinner. Now what happens? Do we stick him in jail? Do we go and get a protective order or something? What do you do in this situation? So it's not all that easy. Nothing's always just in black and white, if you like. Then we always use an interactive strategy so that students are not passive learners, and I'm going to show you how to do that just now. And then lastly, we always give practical advice. If you need a protection order, you can go to the magistrate's court, wherever it is, or you can phone the clerk of the court at such and such a number. So you try and make law relevant to people's lives, not just this education in a textbook somewhere, which not often relevant sometimes. Okay, why are we getting stuck? All right, I want to just show you now something called the learning pyramid, which you can Google. The learning pyramid was a research project done way back in the 1970s at University of Maryland. What they did was they used particular methods of teaching, and then they tested the students' knowledge afterwards to see what their retention rate was. And I usually do this interactively, but we can't do it here. But if you look, at the top of the pyramid is the least effective method. And what is the one which you all use in law schools? Lecturing. 5% retention rate. They tested the students, and after you had lectured to them, they only actually remembered 5% of anything that you said. Then they did another experiment. They said, okay, go away and read the stuff, and then come back to class, and let's see how much. And again, they remembered 10% because their brain was starting to try and process the information. And then they did audio-visual long before you guys started doing digital stuff. But because you're using your eyes and your ears, you tend to remember 20%. And then they said, okay, let's try demonstrations like a 3D movie, where I will show you how a lawyer cross-examines this witness. This is how a lawyer does it. So now it comes alive. It's not just reading. So there they found it was 30%. So those are all the passive learning methods in a way. The ones we want, the interactive ones are where you interact with the students. You put them in small groups, not more than about 5. You make sure that everyone participates in the group, and you get them to discuss a problem and then report back. If you do that properly, they found it was 50%. We do something called token talk. You give each group 5 matches from a box of matches, and you say to the person who's facilitating in the group, one of the 5, every time someone speaks, they surrender a match. And once they've surrendered 5 matches, they can't speak anymore. So everybody gets a chance in the small group to talk then. And then they found that if you did a demonstration, this is how a lawyer cross-examines, but now you come out here and you cross-examine, that the students remember 75% because you do something and you practice it. And then lastly, and this is what street law is all about, and those of you who are law teachers will identify with this, if you teach others, you remember 90%. You learn like a parrot your LLB thesis, your LLB notes, you just regurgitate them in the exams. But when you've got to stand up and teach it, then you really learn it. This has been criticized by some of the exact percentages, but I've tried this all over the world, and everybody agrees it's pretty accurate if you look at what is going on. Okay, so what happened then? Ed O'Brien came. I now wanted to start a pilot street law program for South Africa. So in those days, the Association of Law Societies provided money to the Fidelity Fund, and I wanted then to see if they would just fund a pilot project for us. And I said, if you happen to be here, I don't know if the lawyers still do it, where they have Lawyers' Week, where there's a whole week where they go around employing these huge bloody public relations firms, say why you need a lawyer when you're making a will and every. So I went to the president of the Law Society in Natal, who I knew, and I said, Graham, you guys are spending millions on these public relations. I'll show you a program where every day people will know what the law is. And I started explaining the street law program to him. And when I told him this, just for pilot, he said, you're knocking on an open door. So they funded the first one. And the thing about it was that we made very sure that all points of view, all points of view, we were able to do things. I took Ed at the same time because we were doing a neutral program. I took him around a bit. We even had apartheid government officials arguing, what are the arguments for and against the death penalty? What are the arguments for and against segregated housing? What are the arguments against land invasions or whatever? And the arguments for, and then make up your own. I did this in China, incidentally, way back in the 70s, to try and teach human rights there at the Academy of Sciences. And I could get the Chinese to give all the arguments for and against. But when I said to the group, okay, what do you guys decide? No, we can't make a decision. We have to go and consult with higher authority before we can make any decisions. So, but you can even do this, at least open up people's minds to think about things. We even did in Pretoria 200 prison officers at Pretoria Central Prison, because the Americans found that a street law program they started reduced the recidivism rate by 40%. So in other words, criminals not going back and reoffending. So the prison guys here got interested in that, so we were able to do that. And eventually they allowed us in to do street law for awaiting trial prisoners as well. So after we had met anyway with the Law Society, we employed a guy called Magna, who had been at University of Zululand, came through us for an LLB, sent him off to Bristol for an LLM. He came back and he became our national street law coordinator. Magna did a very good job, and eventually, after working for us for a few years, he actually ran the Independent Electoral Commission's elections in South Africa for the first elections. So he was a fantastic resource. The interesting thing about the street law program, as I mentioned, was Kobe-Coetzee, the minister, had to sign off on the grant. Because what we wanted to do was we wanted to do 2 white schools, 2 African schools, and 1 Indian school, just as a pilot. And Kobe-Coetzee, the minister, said, look, you can't do it unless you actually arrange for a senior counsel. I don't know why the computer spells counsel with an I, but instead of SEL, a senior counsel to give us an opinion that will improve the standard of the legal profession. And I had a friend who was a senior counsel, and that was fairly easy to convince him. Okay, The other thing, and this is very important as well, you need to get influential people in society to assist you. So we got the judiciary, who loved the idea of kids learning about the law, the more liberal judges. We did quite a lot of liberal judges in KZN, and even in the Cape and some of the other provinces. Even those, because what happened was that street law, when eventually took off, was in the law clinics, in these historically black universities, they had planted all sorts of guys who were approved by the Broederbond, so it was more difficult there. But if you were teaching technical law, they didn't mind so much because it was technical. It was a little bit the same in the Afrikaner universities. The English, so the law clinics there focused on technical skills, whereas the English-speaking ones tended to focus on sort of human rights stuff, past laws and that type of thing as well. But in all of those, because you were doing stuff about the law and people were learning, judges were keen to sit and assist the students. And a street law mock trial, which we didn't just do moots, we did mini moots. You all know what a moot is, right? Okay, well, a mini moot is where you divide the class into groups of 3. And you say each number 1 in the group is going to be for the appellant, number 2 will be the judge, number 3 will be for the respondent in a moot. And you have all these mini moots. Once they've all had time to discuss it, they then sit together and do their individual judgments. What we did is mock trials, where we put 24 students, you can do law students first to train them, and then school kids in one case. So you have teams. You'll have 8 for the prosecution, because you have a lead prosecutor who makes an opening statement. You have the prosecutor who will then lead evidence from the first witness, second prosecutor, second witness, third prosecutor, third witness. Then you have somebody doing the closing statement as well. Then you have the prosecutors who are going to cross-examine the defense, the accused, the second witness, the third witness. So you can get teams, and we've prepared manuals, if you're interested in this, of how you can do this. And it works very well because everyone's involved. But then the judges sit and preside. We get real judges to do it. Now, during apartheid, of course, all the judges were white. So what I did was to get some senior counsel who black to sit as judges. And they sat as judges. And often joke that I trained them. Pius Langer, who was our first African CJ, was trained by street law to do. He used to run street law cases for us. Louis Squire, who went off to the Constitutional Court, also ran street law cases for us. So that was a great thing about it, except one colleague, Carthy Govender, who later became a Human Rights Commissioner, was sitting as a judge, and the students sort of followed him into the car park, saw him get into a Toyota and said, "Hang on, you're not a real judge, you're getting in a Toyota, you should be in a Mercedes-Benz." Anyway, so getting judicial support was good because if this security police ever come along, look, the judges support this, it's not subversive. And the same with the Law Society, of course, funding it. But then getting it from the education departments as well, that was important. I don't know, you know how to deal with education now. Because during apartheid, the white, so-called colored and Indian schools had a fair amount of sort of flexibility about the programs they wanted to run. But the African education departments couldn't. The homeland ones had their own ones. There was a Department of Education and Training. They had their own program. And so you ended up dealing with 16 ministries of education. And it depended very much about who the ministers were. And the schools in the white, colored, and Indian was easier to do them. In KZN, we were very lucky. We had Dr. Oscar Lomo, who was a fairly liberal guy. We went to Lundi, the capital, or Buthelezzi's capital there, did a workshop for him and his bureaucrats in typical democratic fashion. He turned to everyone and said, "Okay, everybody, this looks great. You must now introduce it in your schools." "Yes, sir." No consultation or anything. Everybody obeyed. But then what happened was that we got opposition sometimes from school principals. And Mandla got very worried here. We went to Umlazi, big township outside Durban, and one of the things we were telling them was about the importance of people understanding what the law is and when crimes were being committed and so on. And he was upset that the teachers, the students were going to start reporting teachers who were using excessive capital punishment for assault. So these were his exact words. Professor Mason, who are you? Why have you come here to pour poison into our ears and to teach the dogs to rise up and tear out our throats? That's what they thought of it. That's what he thought of his school kids. So I carefully told him, Minister Lomo had told us to do this and everything. Mandla had to hold his hand and calm him down. But eventually we sorted it out, and it was introduced in the schools. Okay, another interesting one was during that time there were a lot of people being detained without trial and people going on hunger strikes. And we weren't allowed in terms of the legislation to condemn them. But I thought of a way of doing this. So I convened a meeting and said, this is a meeting to explain to you what the emergency regulations say. The police came along, this is a political meeting. I said, not a political meeting, it's a legal one. I'm explaining the emergency regulations. And so at the meeting then, I had a list of all the guys we wanted to call for their release. So I said, okay, I know you'd all like to call for the charge or release of Sandile Chuzi, but we can't. And then I took them all the way through the list saying, you want to call for this person, but we can't. So the press could report at that meeting, they were told they wanted to call for the release of this. And so, in fact, we did end up calling for their release. Although technically I kept saying you can't because that's what the law said. So that was one way of doing it, and again, educating the public as to what was going on. Another one, if the police came, I would say, look, if you do this, we'll end up going to court if you try and block us, because we know that if you say to a court that people are not allowed to know what the law is, the courts are going to throw out your case. So just let us get on with this meeting. It's a legal meeting. We're explaining what we should do as law professors and legal academics. Okay, turning a protest meeting into a teaching one. I'll just forget about the slide and just talk. What happened was Soweto Day, June the 16th, 1989, where we were still sort of under apartheid. The students at our Alan Taylor Res, which was a black residence in Durban, had called together a meeting to be addressed by one of the young lions of Soweto. And the security police heard about this, so I knew they were going to try and ban it. So there happened to be an American law professor and his Australian girlfriend, also a law teacher, and I thought I'd take them along as insurance to the meeting, because I'll then tell the police that, listen, the Americans and Australians think we got democracy in South Africa, and I don't want you guys to do anything to make them think we don't have democracy here. They arrived there, 2 combi loads of armed riot police waiting to break up the meeting. So I go and address the officer in charge, or the sergeant in charge, and say, look, Professor Slavenko is here from America, and his girlfriend from Australia. They believe we've got democracy. Please don't let your guys do anything to spoil our international reputation. No, sir, of course we won't. I said, okay, good. So now the Lion of Soweto is late. So the kids start putting up banners on the stage. Liberation before education. So then I see the cops all getting out. So I go up to this guy in charge and say, now hold on. Remember I told you, Professor Slavenko, he's in the back of the hall. His friend is there from Australia. If they go back to Australia and America and say, you know, in South Africa, you cannot even put a banner up, what are they going to think about democracy in our country? Yeah, well, okay, then put the bloody banner up, but they must get on with the damn meeting, okay? So we get on with the meeting. The Lion of Soweto is still late, so now they start singing songs. Viva Mandela, Viva Tamba. Again, the cops now all getting it. I go, now what's happening? No, these bloody students are singing communist songs. I said, hold it. Remember what I said about our reputation internationally. Professor Slavenko goes back to America. You know, in South Africa, you cannot even sing at a meeting in a hall. And what is the lady from Australia going to say? No, well, okay, Professor. But they can get on with the bloody meeting. So they get on. Eventually he arrives. He gives his spiel. Another colleague of mine who later became an advisor to one of the ANC ministers gives a speech about Soweto Day. And then it was my turn. So I said, just before I start, everyone, will you please, there were 800 students in the hall, please just all turn around and look behind, because there's a man in a blue safari suit who's got a video camera and he's videoing this meeting. And these guys in their safari suits, there are 3 of them there, say they're police officers. The law says that we can ask them to identify themselves. Please, Sergeant van der Merwe, please identify yourself. I'm not a sergeant, I'm a warrant officer. Okay, warrant officer van der Merwe. So they put up their ID documents and everybody claps. Okay, guys, turn around. Now, I'm glad you're videoing, because you did a whole lot of things last week which were in breach of the emergency regulations and the law when you raided the hostel here. And I just want to give you a list of them, because I want you to take this video back to the police college and train your police officers properly. Then I took them through the things they'd done. They'd confiscated spectacles, they'd confiscated books and things. And I just took them all the way through that. And then, there was one funny incident. Prof. Slavenko, a very conservative guy, but quite shy. And when the Lion of Soweto heard that he was in the audience, comrades, I just want to mention that Comrade Slavenko is here. Please, Comrade Slavenko, stand up and identify us. This poor old guy was sort of trying to hide and look. Anyway, it was great. So at the end, I now go back to the warrant officer. Warrant officer, you know, you guys nearly upset our international reputation. But thank goodness you didn't. Geez, thank you, Prof, you know. Geez, it was so bloody difficult, man. And then I promise you, this is what he said. You know, but we know we've got your blue street law book. Maybe if we follow your blue street law book, we'll be okay. And I thought that was a fantastic endorsement. Okay, the other one was to use professional legal bodies to advance, because there was always this sort of obedience to authority under apartheid. One of the things I wanted to do was to try and get, we had in South Africa at the time, there was the Black Lawyers Association, which is still going today, which in those days was linked to the Pan-Africanist Congress, the NADEL, National Association of Democratic Lawyers, which I belonged to, which was linked to the ANC. And then the formal legal profession was seen as white, sort of dominated, because 85% of the legal profession was white, 85% population, of course, black. And both of them were providing, both the black organizations were trying to provide services for victims of apartheid. What I learned was that the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights was in town, and someone called Gay McDougall was with them. And I wanted to try and get all the law societies, the black ones and the white ones together, to condemn detention without trial. Because I knew, even though technically the law you couldn't, but if we got all the representative organizations, the apartheid authorities wouldn't dare to do anything. So I got hold of Gay McDougall and said, Gay, can we organize a press conference? I want to put you together, the American lawyers, together with the South African lawyers, to condemn what's going on here. So she said, of course. So then I got hold of the president of the Law Society, who I knew, and said, listen, the American lawyers are in town, Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. They're going to issue a statement. It'll look very strange if you guys don't say something. So don't you want to say something from the Natal Law Society? So he said, yes, we'll come along and do a statement. Then I phoned the bar, the advocates, and said, advocates, you know that the Americans and the attorneys are going to make a statement. You guys are going to look very stupid if you don't make a statement. Do you want to join us? So they all joined, and the whole lot, we had for the first time all the law societies getting together and actually condemning something and showing the public again, human rights in the broad sense, that detention without trial was wrong. Okay, the other one was, I do a lot of law and medical practice, medical ethics stuff. And after Biko's death, you probably know, if you know a bit about your history, but the then medical board of the South African Medical and Dental Council didn't find the Biko. You remember what happened when Biko died? How Biko was left chained. He was, first of all, he was sent from in Port Elizabeth or Quebec. He was kept in a cell. He was kept naked, chained to the floor on a blanket, and then he was beaten by the security police. And then he was so badly injured, the district surgeons, doctors there, believed what the security police said, that he'd banged his head against the wall. They hadn't done anything to him. They put him in the back of a van. They sent him with a drip attached to him to be driven to Pretoria at 1,600 Ks or whatever, 1,000 Ks or whatever it was. By the time he got there, the drip had gone and Biko died. Now, the year before that, South Africa had signed the Tokyo Declaration about dealing torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, which said medical practitioners are not allowed to countenance, look at, condone, say it's okay, or participate in torture of any forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And that's exactly what had happened to Biko. So what I did was I called together a meeting of NAMDA, which was formed after the Medical Council made their decision. NAMDA was the National Medical and Dental Association, mainly black doctors in opposition again. I called a meeting of them at the medical school because some of them, psychiatrists particularly, were asked to come and talk to these detainees. They're threatening to commit suicide, and we don't want them to die. So we want you guys to treat them, give them antidepressants or something so that we can carry on interrogating them. So I said, guys, I hear this is what you're doing. You're not allowed to do this. This is a breach of the Tokyo Declaration, which we've signed. What you're doing is unethical. So one guy puts his hand up, but Prof, we can't do anything. It's the security police. I said, listen, you write a letter to this. You go to the security police. With you have a letter saying, I'm giving you notice that I cannot treat this detainee in solitary anymore because that is torture. And unless you put that detainee in a psychiatric ward of a hospital, I'm not prepared to treat them. And if the patient commits suicide and dies, it's going to be your responsibility, not mine, because I cannot do anything that's unethical. He said, can we really do that? I said, go ahead and try it. A couple of days later, I get a call from Dr. Valji, who is a well-known psychiatrist there. He said, Prof, I did not realize I had so much power. I did what you told us to do and handed them the note you suggested. It was amazing. They immediately caved in, transferred the detainee to the psychiatric wing of Addington Hospital in Durban. So Mandela always said knowledge is power, and this was very true here as well. But there was always this tendency to obey authority. Let me just give you one more example. We tried to desegregate the beaches and Addington Hospital by busing in 10,000 people from the townships. And there were a whole lot of adventures I had with that, but the one we had in particular I want to talk about was at the hospital where the outpatients were. Security police were standing right next to the doctors and nurses as they were looking at as they were examining patients. So I got hold, said, who's in charge here? Got hold of the guy, said, now listen, you are not allowed to have your men stand near patients and doctors or nurses because that is a violation of their professional rules. And you cannot do that. That's illegal. Oh, sorry, Professor, I didn't know that. And so they moved everybody away. So again, they had this thing about authority. If you had authority, they would cave into it. All right, then 1990, we get the release of Mandela. You probably all remember that, although some of you might have been too small to see it. Then I had fun because I spent quite a bit of time with him. His son was a student. But then what we were able to do is talk more openly about human rights. And we wanted to introduce, under the street law program, South Africans, black and white, because South Africa never signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948, just as the nationalists came in. So they didn't know about it, and black South Africans didn't also know. So we put together a book which we decided to call Human Rights for All. And we based it on the Universal Declaration. And there was one incredibly moving incident we had, because we field tested this with the street law coordinator in a rural area in Deadware outside Durban. There were, as happens, only old men and old women left because the youngsters had all gone into town. And we were doing, I wanted to show them where you get a clash between culture and human rights. And I said, you know, in a particular community, it is okay for husbands to beat their wives if they don't do their jobs properly. Do you think that's a violation of human rights? The old men all sit in a group, the old ladies in a group. Ask the old men first. Old man stands up. No, this is not a violation. It's part of our culture. Is it a violation of human rights? No, our culture comes first. Sounds a bit like an ex-president, but anyway, that's what he said. Then he sat down. Then a very old gogo, very old, well, probably a great gogo, stood up, very old lady. She was a bit shaky, but she was very courageous, and she said, "My father, what you say is not correct. Before the whites came here and took away your dignity as men, you treated us with respect. It was only after you lost your dignity as men that you began abusing us." And I thought that was very moving, and I've used this in Australia with Aborigines, same story. I've done it all over Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, everywhere, and everybody can identify with this. One of the effects of colonialism, in a way, was to reinforce that. But that was a very interesting take on it, and as we know, this was before our constitution, which says that culture is recognized, but it mustn't violate the rights of others in terms of the Bill of Rights. Okay, so here we produced then Human Rights for All, and then the Americans thought it was a good idea, so we could also do a copy for America, Human Rights for All. But the Americans, if they wanted to get into their schools, were a bit more sensitive. We couldn't show a traffic officer taking a bribe, because that never happens in America. And we had to make our cartoons not quite as sort of earthy, if you like, as the ones in the South African book. But that book then, we also decided to, when we started hearing we're going to have elections, to produce Democracy for All, where that was trying to explain the principles of democracy for our first democratic elections. And we put together a whole manual on that. I'll show you just now. And that manual was amazing because, again, what it did was, what is democracy? How do human rights underpin democracy? How do you control, how does government work in democracy? How do you vote in a democracy? And how do you stop abuses of power in democracy? That was what we were doing. Because, you know, all the other NGOs, there were 22 of them in KZN, were all talking about how to vote. They weren't actually talking about why you vote and what you should do about democracy, and that's what we wanted to do. So they agreed to walk with us to produce this democracy manual. And we also, this again has been translated into all sorts of languages, I'll show you just now. And then we also produced a game called the Democracy Challenge Game, which was a game of a mixture of Trivial Pursuit, you guys heard of Trivial Pursuit, and Monopoly. And what you have to do is collect the 13 signposts of democracy that we had actually developed for the manual, and the signposts were different cards, and if you landed on, say, the abolition of the death penalty or something card, you then had to argue what the definition of that was. What does it mean to abolish the death penalty? What does it mean to respect another's culture, whatever? And you had to conduct a little mini debate. And if you won the debate when you landed on the card, you kept the card. If you didn't win the debate, you lost it. So we sort of mixed it up. So there's our Democracy for War manual, translated into Romanian, translated into Mongolian. They even used sort of de Klerk and Mandela looked Chinese in the Mongolian one. And then they did La Démocratie pour tous in Haïtia. And then this is the modern version of Democracy for All, which we did a few years ago, just after Fees Must Fall. It's all about fees must fall and those sort of things. And here's our Democracy Challenge game. And then I got a phone call from Nigeria. Please, will you come and help us launch a board game? So I said, what is this board game? No, you know your Democracy for All challenge? I said, yes, no, we've made one for children's rights. We based it on your game. So I said, okay, that's great. I guess there was no copyright agreement, but all right, I'll come. So I went off to Nigeria, and that was one hell of a trip because we had to drive 300 kilometers through the bush. We got 20 kilometers outside Adi-Akiti, the town I was going to, and they were still building the freeway, but it had been half open, but the locals had put a plank with large nails across the road, and they weren't allowing anybody to go unless they paid a toll to the local villagers. And there were the advocates in Nigeria wear wigs and gowns, and they were all there, their wigs and gowns, and the villagers were saying, no, pay, and then you can go, pay, you can go. So we went there, we went for about 10 Ks, and suddenly I see on the side of the road, middle of the island, a woman lying with her head lying next to her. She'd been decapitated. So I say to these guys who are taking me, who were so-called human rights guys, shouldn't we stop and do something? No, she's in the bush. She's not worrying anybody. We've got to keep going. So off we went. Those are the human rights guys. Oh, I guess technically you're dead. You don't have any human rights anyway. But okay, off we went. I gave the workshop for about 3 or 4 days. And then coming back, other side of the road, we come across a burnt-out car with a burnt body. So I say, what about that one? No, don't worry about it, not disturbing anybody. Afterwards, I heard that people were sometimes using these to ambush you as well if you stopped or something. Anyway, we kept driving back. We got just about there, then we suddenly had a blowout in the middle of the jungle. And these guys were driving a Mercedes, these human rights guys, a Mercedes. We're in a Mercedes, you've got a flat tire in the middle of the jungle. Guy drives about another K, and there's a pole in the road with a tire hanging from it. And he stops. And the guy brings out a generator and his whole kit for fixing tires. And he fixed our puncture, and off we went. We drive into Lagos, and we're on the freeway into the city. And in the middle of all the garbage between the freeways, I see another damn body. This is 3 bodies on this trip. Was when Obacha was still president. And I say, now, shouldn't we stop and do something about this person? No, it's amongst the garbage. He'll be picked up by the garbage guys tomorrow and taken off to a mortuary. So that was my... Then I arrived back, and then the guys wanted me to introduce this Dignity Challenge board game on the TV. So I said, well, how long have you got on the TV? So we got 1 hour, 1 hour show on a commercial. How do you pay for this? Well, did you have to pay a bribe? I said, no, it's not a bribe, just a small incentive. So they introduced the thing, and then we had parliamentarians phoning in. We want this game. You guys must, because I also did the our Democracy Challenge game. We want your Democracy game. We need it for our politicians to train them. Because that game was actually field tested in 500 schools. And you can get up to teams of 16 people playing that game, collecting the signposts of democracy. So it worked very well. Anyway, I'm getting towards the end now, I think. Just to say, Ed O'Brien, the guy who helped me develop street law, which became like Coca-Cola because I wanted to translate it into isiZulu and you couldn't do it, so it became e-street law. So it's like a Coke sign. And as I say, it's 45 countries now. But I wanted to do something in honor of Ed O'Brien, so I got 20 countries to give me their best street law lessons and put them together in this book, which gives you the methodologies. I wrote the first bit all about the different methodologies and things, and it was published by tutors. Okay, so really just to conclude, even during a hostile environment, if you use the law creatively, and you're creative about how you do things, you can teach people, you can teach not only the professions, but also the education departments, the children, the students, everybody, prisoners, about human rights, even sometimes without even mentioning it. Always need to find, always needs to find, always doesn't matter how democratic your country is, there will always be somebody there who you can reach out to. And if you're dealing with a technical subject like law, if you emphasize the technical aspects, these often appeal to them as well. And then if you want to be creative, you can use them for meetings and things which some people think are just illegal. After Mandela's release, of course, we were able to do a lot of things more easily. Carta Asmal was a great fan of this. Madiba, he sent us a letter. But as happens in our country, nothing really gets implemented. We did eventually have a resolution which we presented to the UN that all our schools, and I think the Human Rights Commission has promoted it now with the Basic Education Department, all our schools are going to be doing street law education about human rights from next year. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for this inspiring speech. And perhaps the first question that I would like to ask you, we spoke already yesterday, and so we've heard today that there was some scope that you could use to advance human rights. So you kind of saw certain loopholes for exercising your academic freedom. You said yesterday that, so surprisingly, there was a bit of scope for academic freedom, especially among English universities, and the sentiment one hears quite a bit these days where we are in the democratic South Africa is that our university environments, which are really very performatist, very economically driven, actually make people very tired. So it's obviously the new liberalist agenda, one could say, that stifles academic freedom, of course. What do you think about that?
Well, it's what I've said. I mean, I actually managed to stave off as dean these super faculties for years, you know, because I always want to put law and management or something together. And have you guys still got an independent law faculty? You have, you know, not many universities have still got them. So you're very fortunate you've done that as well. But it's right, it's difficult to stave it off, but you've got to play the academic game. And the publications, you play the academic game. Under COVID, 1 year I produced 10 articles. How did I do it? I approached journals which publish short case notes. And if you publish a short case note, it counts the same as a 20 or 30 page article. So don't waste your time writing 20 or 30 page articles, provided you do it succinctly. I mean, if you think of Einstein, he could write his whole thesis on relativity in 2 pages or something. But as long as if you know you really know your stuff, you can produce short, succinct articles. Many of them I writing were about 6 type pages, but they were the sort of articles that the medical profession straight away would pick up on and want more workshops on, and they're based on practical things that are happening. So, but I know one of the things, and lawyers always charge so much for every 100 words or whatever it is, every folio, but academics tend to be over verbose. And it happens particularly in a second language situation where we tend to use big words. I mean, I don't know if you've read any Indian articles or Indian PhD. I've actually had to examine Indian PhDs in that. But they use huge, long words to say very simple things. And one of the rules of writing we always used to observe was, and it's been a movement internationally, the plain English movement, if you like, use the shortest meaningful word, use short sentences, use short paragraphs for each. Well, you probably know more about it than me, but okay. So play the academic game, but play it creatively. And set yourself a target. I mean, that's a big thing as well. You know, time flies, so particularly at my age when you get older, but time flies always. When I started doing my thesis as a full-time lecturer, I was lecturing 5 courses at the time. And I used to just put a slot at the end of my day, 1 hour, to be set aside for research or whatever. And if I missed that hour, I've got to do 2 hours the next day. And just draw up a timetable of how you're managing your time. Nowadays, you guys have got all the technology to help you do that. Get organized, in other words. Time management.
Thank you, David. Prof. Robert, do you have a question to ask? Otherwise, Richard?
There's nothing from the chat, but I just want to say, for those who are attending online, please do just post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A function so I can pass them on to the professor. So I'm, Professor, if you don't mind, I'll just take the liberty. I'm lecturing constitutional law and human rights, and it's a very big class, 450 students.
How big?
450 students.
Yeah, okay, that's
in one
big,
class.
yeah.
And in the first semester, we have to teach all of the structures of the state. Second semester, all of the Bill of Rights, and that's it. That's all they get on the Constitution for their law degree, unless they take an elective. And because of the regulations for how a degree gets accredited and stuff, like we need to get across a whole lot of content in a big, thick textbook. You discussed all these sort of street law approaches, and I think they're really phenomenal, and that's a real good way to do meaningful education that's student-centered and stuff. But how do we, when we're stuck as lecturers, having to do this kind of thing, to churn out content, just like drop it into their brains without real engagement? How can we try and do better? We feel like it's a double bind.
Did you remember the third element of what I told you in our mantra? Less is more. You can do your book, that's fine. In your class, you get the students to discuss the basic principles and they go and read the book for the detail. So the advantage we have, I mean, our curriculum sets out what you've got to do. It doesn't tell you how you have to teach it. And the best way of teaching, I mean, if you've got a textbook, you can say to the students, look, next week we're going to do whatever it is, go to my textbook, look at page whatever of the notes, and then they come back and you say, okay, you guys, I'm dividing you into 3s now, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All the number 1s get together, you're going to be for the appellants. You now are going to present the arguments for the appellants in this case. Number 2s, you're all going to be judges, get in a group, think about what sort of judgment you might give. You're going to have to listen to the arguments first. Number 3s, you guys are now for the respondents. And at the end of the day, I want you to hand in your mini heads of argument for both sides. So you use that resource that you had to develop, but in the methodology, you rely on them to go and do the research. They're getting used to do research and so on as well. That help you? Let me show you what I did with 1,500 Nigerian practical legal training students. I was in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, and a friend, Richard Grimes, who ran a big program for the law societies in England on street law, which I trained him for. We were asked to go for 2 weeks to teach them about interactive teaching methods. So we're in Abuja. The guys say, end of the first day, I've got 20 law professors. The second week, I've got another 20. End of the first day, one guy comes up and says, Prof, what you're doing is fantastic. You're only 20 of us here. I've got 1,500 in my class. So I said, great, okay. Where? Can you set up something? What about this week? Okay, Wednesday. Would Wednesday evening do, he says? I say, yeah, fine, great, we'll go. Richard, the English guy. David, what are you doing? What the hell are you doing? 1,500. Relax, Richard. Okay, so we go off in a minivan. We had to drive 26 Ks. We had armed guards with us, so we didn't get hijacked in Nigeria to go there. We arrived, they'd taken over our old holiday camp, was now where they did their school for legal practice there. And the holiday camp, I walk in now, the Nigerian students are very formal, as is their legal profession. They all wear wigs and things, but the students all dressed in their suits. So I arrived there, 1,500 students. So I walk in, evening, using my usual African clothes, morning everybody, evening everyone. How many of you have heard of the case, the one you've just heard? Regina versus Dudley and Stevens. They're all common law, they all stick their hands up. Okay, let me tell you what we're going to do today. We're going to discuss this case, and we're going to have teams of prosecutors, we're going to have judges, and we're going to have defense lawyers. Okay? Before we do that, you heard of the case, someone want to tell me the facts. Richard, you get on a PowerPoint and you put up the arguments as you hear them later, and then we'll see what the judges say. All right, so let's start first. Prosecutors, I want you guys to sit together, just talk to each other in buzz groups. You've got 10 minutes to prepare your arguments. That's you 500, all prosecutors. Your arguments on what you would argue as prosecutors in this case. Defense lawyers, you 1,500, you 500 over here. You guys have got 10 minutes to prepare your defense. You're going to have to, though, of course, listen also to what the prosecution says, because you won't have a right of reply. They'll have a right of reply for a couple of minutes. Judges, you 500 in the middle, 10 minutes to think about this case, because you can't make a decision until you've heard what the lawyers say. Okay, everybody ready? Yes, off you go. Well, Richard says, geez, they're making a noise. Tell them to keep quiet. I said, they're 1,500. They're supposed to make a noise, Richard. Anyway, so they go on. End of 10 minutes. Okay, prosecutors, let's have your first argument. All their hands up. Go up, grab someone. Tell us your argument. Gives us the argument. Richard puts it up on the screen. Second argument, yes. Third argument, yes. Fourth, yes. Fifth, yes. Any others? Don't repeat. No, that's all right. Thanks, prosecutors. Now listen carefully to defense. You'll have a couple of minutes to reply at the end, but only to what they raise, not repeat your old points, okay? Defense lawyers, let's have yours. Hands all go up. Okay, 1, 2, 3, whatever. Now remember, you've also got to answer what the prosecutor said. Okay, so they do theirs. Put it up on the screen. Right. Judges, we've heard all the arguments. You guys have got 10 minutes to think about how you would deliver your judgment. All right, judges, off you go. Now, 500 there, sitting as judges discussing. Now you've still got 1,000 here. You've got 500 prosecutors. All right, prosecutors, what was the best argument of the defense? So they tell us, okay? Defense, what was the best argument of the prosecutors? And then what was the next one? And you just take them through so that everybody is participating all the time. In the end, okay, judgments. How many are going to find them guilty? Hands up. All right, let's hear your judgment. Off they go. Select a whole lot. Any dissenting judgments? Any judges want to say something else? Yes, okay. Go through. So at the end, so we had a great time. We just went on and everybody thoroughly enjoyed it. So the next week now, on the second day of the next week, I start getting calls from the guys who had attended the first week. Prof, I don't believe it. I used to do 6 hours of PowerPoint. I was exhausted. The students were exhausted. But I tried what you did the other night. And I was still full of energy. And the students were still full of energy. We didn't want to stop. Okay, so you can do these things. Just be creative. Buzz groups, and there are a whole lot of different methodologies we can use. Yeah.
Maybe another question. We already spoke about that a bit yesterday, and of course we know a hot topic these days is the decolonization of the curriculum. And I said yesterday that the way I understand it, it is all about breaking the dominance of a Western epistemology or one knowledge system. And but we also see that the concept seems to be abused to kind of, many use it to say, many universities might use it to say, well, our curriculum now is decolonized. It's become a branding technique, the same way that universities say, we are a sustainable university. So these are like words being used. What do you think about the decolonization topic in the context of the university? How do you understand it? And do you think it is perhaps an exaggerated concept?
Well, I mentioned it briefly earlier on. I think really it's not, you can call it decolonization, call it whatever you need. But what we have to do is make law relevant to people's lives so that people want to obey the law and they feel comfortable with the law and they respect the law. And if you don't do that, now, as I said before, whether we keep what is good about, and concepts like Ubuntu and so on, which are good from our traditional legal system, let's use that and let's recognize a parallel system, provided it doesn't violate our basic human rights. So that sort of pre-colonial law, take what's good from pre-colonial times. Take good things from colonial times. There are certain things that we can use and which we need to have structures and things which are useful. Obviously, you don't go into building towns and motor cars and cell phone, all that sort of stuff. We're just talking about legal principles of putting the law together. Take what's useful there. And then look at we're in a modern world. We're into digitalization. We've got a whole lot of stuff here, the digital revolution. That's all new stuff. Let's use that as well, where it is relevant to people's lives. And then we've got to always think about the law as not just simply something written in a book and we pretend that we approve it. Our constitution's just a bit of paper, forget about it. We've got to get people to buy into the legal system. And the same with lawyers, but you've got to get them thinking outside the box. Nowadays you can't just be a village anymore like in pre-colonial times. We now live in a world where we're interacting with the whole world all the time. I mean, you see what's happening even with the chaos going on in England, how that affects all the growth of the economy and everything, because internationally, if China or Russia sneeze and then we can't export to them, we get hit by that cold as well. So we can't escape, we can't retreat back into. We've got to look at what is, and that's your point about you take from everywhere the best. And the other thing is that the winning nations in this world are not losers or victims. If you have a victim mentality, you're never going to be a succeeding nation. You need to get on and advance. And I understand the claim for reparations, but reparations away as a colonial concept as well, because you feel I'm a prisoner of colonization, therefore I've got to be compensated. Forget about being a prisoner. Be a winner. We want to get out there and win. The best example is actually Singapore. I don't know if you guys have ever studied Singapore. Singapore was poorer than Ghana at independence on the tip of Malaysia. What the Singaporeans did, they got a guy who had won all sorts of awards at Oxford or something overseas, highly intelligent guy, and he said, we're going to move, we're going to get everybody educated, once we're educated, we forget about all this colonial stuff, we're not interested in them, we are winners, we're going to make a winning nation. And they're now one of the tigers, 5 million people or whatever they are. We've got to become winners. We've got to stop thinking about, we the losers, we the victims, and we've got to stop accepting lower standards than everybody else. Why should we get less rights than people in other countries? We were a moderately rich country. I mean, if you think of the billions that have been stolen, how much of that could have been put into housing, health, education for everybody, no more pit latrines, no more kids going to school in little sort of mud huts and things. But all of that is wasted. Why? Because creeping capitalism, everyone has become capitalists. Even the Chinese are capitalists. The other thing is, who are the biggest colonizers in the world today? Who are the two modern colonizers in the world? China and Russia. China, all those Islamic states north of China, all had the independence taken away. The Uyghurs, Tibetans have had their independence taken away. You go to Russia, same story, the Chechens, all the guys in the south, their rights all taken away. But who are the first guys to scream anti-colonialism? The Russians and the Chinese. Why? Because they were our friends. During the struggle, they helped us, okay. But they become the new neo-colonizers. They've got land in Mozambique, they've got land all over the show now in Africa. And we've got to say, guys, we're winners, we don't need your help, buzz off. Don't come and interfere with us.
Thank you, David. Richard, is there a question?
There's not, but I will ask another one if I don't mind. So I'm very new to a whole lot of street law stuff, so pardon my not knowing anything, but I think a lot of us would like to know, I mean, these are all such great ideas. How do we actually, like, this is a very practical question, like, is there someone we can speak to? Do we send emails to an organization, the books and stuff? What recommendations do you have? How do we do this?
Well, one recommendation I'd be, and it's an open access document. You can get it for free. It's called the African Law Clinicians Manual. It's got 28 street law interactive teaching methods in it and how to do them. But that's got a whole lot of stuff in there. There's a Street Law Inc. site, if you want to go to the American street law site. There's the South African street law. It's also got a website. And there's in your favorite place in Stellenbosch, the 11th to the 15th of December, there's a conference there, the Global Alliance for Justice Education, which will have training sessions in both clinical legal education, which is interactive teaching with a social justice emphasis, and street law education, plus papers. And you can go to Gauge, 11th Worldwide Conference, and you can check their website. And there you'll meet guys who are doing this interactive teaching from all over the world, 60 countries. Okay.
Great, thanks so
Put
much.
up you just Google the African Law Clinicians Manual.
Will do.
Thank you so much, David. The time has come for me to give you just a small token of appreciation for coming here, really taking it upon yourself to come to Potchefstroom, deliver our academic freedom speech. We were so glad to have you here. This comes from the DVC's office, but additionally, there is something from the law faculty, and I took the liberty to put in 2 of my very long articles. Yes, so we are almost at the end. We skipped a part at the beginning, but it's fine. I'll just say a few words now at the end about why this academic freedom lecture is important to us. Now, we had a discussion like a few weeks ago. I was invited by the law faculty to speak to the law students. And the topic was freedom of speech, cancel culture, and inclusion in the university. And so I started speaking about the purpose or the mission of the university. And I asked that question to the students. And a common answer would be to say, well, the university is there to produce graduates for the market. Or to say, well, the university is there to produce output which can be used to advance, knowledge, technology, and be useful in industry. And then I said, well, according to ideals of the Enlightenment, the purpose of the university is really to discover the truth. And I think that startled the students quite a bit. But then I said, in order to discover the truth, we need this freedom that we call academic freedom. Now, the Magna Carta Universitartum, which is a document drawn up in 1988 by rectors, It's been updated in 2020 and it is supervised by the Magna Carta Observatory in Bologna, to which I'm ambassador. There is a statement in there saying, academic freedom is the lifeblood of the university. But then I went on to explain to the students, in order for academic freedom to fulfill its purpose, it must have a certain nature. And I said it must be a very robust form of freedom of speech. So it means we must really focus on discourse rather than on the production of outputs. Our findings are not validated anymore. 90% of articles do not receive a single citation. So whom do we publish all that for? So we need discourse. And I said we must be free from dogmas in universities, religious dogmas, fascism, from neoliberalism. And I also added that excessive caution for identity politics will also not help us further. We are an academic community, we need robust discussion, but then I said it is a different form of freedom of speech that we have in the universities. It is not just the freedom of speech that we have outside on the streets, because there you even have the freedom to tell lies, but as academic freedom is directed at the discovery of the truth, we have a duty towards objectivity. We have a duty towards criticality, like Stuart Hall, the British sociologist, said, a university is a critical institution or it is nothing. And we have a duty towards judgment. We need to judge. We need to establish the facts and then judge. And that is something we become afraid of, because we've come to see our students not so much as citizens anymore, but as customers, because they pay a lot. So they expect a degree in return. They become passive in the education process. And we as teachers do defensive education. We do not provoke anymore. We are afraid of making judgments. So I explained that to the students, and I thought, well, I don't know if they could follow me. But 3 days later, one of the students came to my office and he said he was so fascinated by the idea that the university does not actually produce graduates, but that it is there for the truth, that he went to get all the books he could get in the library about the purpose of the university, read about it, and he said in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, he will want to do research on the topic of what the purpose of the university is and about the importance of academic freedom. And I would like to leave our audience with that. Thanks again, David, for coming. It was such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you very much. I'll give the Kingdom of KwaZulu-Natal your regards.
Thank you very much. See you again next year.